a black businesswoman, fresh from delivering a keynote speech at an international conference, was ready to board her private jet and return home. But when she arrived at the terminal, everything changed. A flight crew member refused to let her board, dismissing her credentials and humiliating her in front of the staff. Just 10 minutes later, her response left everyone stunned and set off a ripple effect that no one could have predicted. What unfolded next revealed the quiet power of standing firm against prejudice. Stay with me, this is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if this story inspires you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more moments of resilience and justice. In the shimmering light of the private airport terminal, Ophelia Harris, an accomplished entrepreneur, prepared to board her jet. Her tailored navy blazer and understated pearls spoke of quiet confidence. Ophelia's presence was a testament to her resilience, a journey marked by overcoming countless barriers. The airport buzzed with the movements of executives and affluent travelers. She approached the counter with her flight details, but the cool gaze of the attendant foreshadowed the challenges ahead. The morning sun cast its golden glow across the polished floors of the private terminal, its light refracting through the gleaming windows. It was a place designed for comfort, a refuge for the privileged. Soft leather chairs, the faint aroma of fresh coffee, and the low murmur of distant conversations created a sense of exclusivity that Ophelia Harris had come to understand but never truly belonged to. At least in the eyes of others. She adjusted her pearl earrings, a habit she had developed over the years to steady herself before stepping into places where assumptions were made before introductions. At 62, Ophelia had earned every bit of her success. She wasn't just an entrepreneur, she was a pioneer. Yet, no tailored blazer, no perfectly coiffed hairstyle, no shining accolade pinned to her name seemed to shield her from the gaze that followed her, now a subtle narrowing of eyes. A flicker of disbelief. Ophelia approached the counter with measured steps, the quiet click of her heels an unspoken declaration of her right to be there. The attendant, a young woman with a practiced smile, barely glanced up as she greeted her. "Good morning, ma'am. Name and flight details, please." "Ophelia Harris, private flight to Chicago," she replied, her tone calm but deliberate, the kind that spoke of someone accustomed to being second-guessed. The attendant's fingers danced across the keyboard. The pause that followed was subtle but telling. Her eyes darted to Ophelia, her polite smile faltering ever so slightly before she nodded. "Yes, Ms. Harris, the flight is ready. Would you like to wait in the lounge or board now?" "I'll board now, thank you." Ophelia's smile was small but firm as she gathered her bag and headed toward the gate. She could feel the weight of eyes on her back, not hostile, but curious, as though her very presence required justification. It was the kind of scrutiny that had followed her all her life. One that whispered, "Are you sure you belong here?" As she neared the gleaming jet, another figure emerged. This one larger, more imposing. Captain Mitchell Green stood at the bottom of the steps, his posture rigid, his expression impassive but cold. His uniform was immaculate, his polished shoes reflecting the sunlight like mirrors. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone clipped, his eyes scanning her like an item in need of appraisal. Ophelia stopped, meeting his gaze head-on. "I'm here for the flight to Chicago." His brow furrowed, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "This is a private flight," he said slowly, as though explaining a complicated concept to a child. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "It's my flight." The smirk deepened, his eyes sweeping over her tailored blazer, her designer suitcase, and landing, unspoken but clear, on her skin. "Right," he said, folding his arms. "And I'm the president." Ophelia felt her grip tighten on her bag, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch between them, her composure unbroken. "I'll need to see some documentation," he added, the smirk fading into something more guarded. Before Ophelia could respond, another figure appeared, a flight attendant named Aaron. Clipboard in hand, she glanced at Ophelia, her smile polite but her eyes filled with doubt. "Is there a problem, Captain?" "She claims this is her flight," Green said, the skepticism in his voice thick enough to cut. Without a word, Ophelia retrieved her phone, tapping a few times before holding it out. The email was clear, her name, the flight number, the destination. Erin's eyes widened slightly as she read it, her face paling. "It's all in order," she said softly, handing the phone back. Green's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside reluctantly. "Welcome aboard," he muttered, though the words carried none of the warmth they implied. As Ophelia ascended the steps of her own jet, she felt the tension hanging in the air behind her like a storm cloud. This was not new. This was not extraordinary. This was the daily, grinding weight of being questioned in spaces where she belonged, of fighting for dignity in a world eager to strip it away. Inside the cabin, she set her bag down and took a seat. Her expression unreadable. She had won this round. But the game itself was far from over. The quiet luxury of the jet surrounded her, but it could not drown out the faint hum of something darker. Something pervasive. The day was only just beginning. The cabin of the jet exuded a quiet opulence. Its cream-colored leather seats and dark walnut accents a reflection of Ophelia Harris' hard-won success. Yet as she settled into her seat, the air was thick with a discomfort she could not ignore. The tension from the interaction with Captain Green lingered, a quiet reminder that no amount of achievement could insulate her from the unspoken hierarchies woven into everyday life. The young flight attendant, Erin, approached hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly around the clipboard. Her smile was brittle, a thin mask of professionalism stretched over something less pleasant. "Would you like a drink before takeoff, Ms. Harris?" she asked. "Water, please," Ophelia replied, her tone polite but measured. Erin nodded and turned, but her steps faltered as Captain Green entered the cabin, his presence a sharp intrusion into the space. His eyes flickered briefly to Ophelia before settling on Erin. "Step outside with me for a moment," he said to her, his voice low but firm. Erin glanced at Ophelia, then back at the captain, her unease visible. She followed him out, the cabin door hissing softly as it sealed behind them. Ophelia leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap. But her mind was restless. She had been in this position too many times before, the subject of whispered conferences. Her competence or legitimacy debated just out of earshot. It was not the overt slurs or shouted insults that wore a person down, it was this. The constant questioning, the quiet erosion of dignity by 1,000 unspoken doubts. Minutes stretched uncomfortably long before Erin returned, her face pale and her movements stiff. She placed a glass of water on the tray table with a faint clink, avoiding eye contact as she murmured, "Let me know if you need anything else." Ophelia watched her retreat, her own expression unreadable. She did not need to hear the conversation to understand its gist. Green's attitude had been clear enough, and Erin's uncertainty reflected the unspoken calculations she had undoubtedly been forced to make, whether to align herself with authority or to stand on principle. The engines hummed to life, and the jet began its taxi down the runway. Ophelia closed her eyes briefly, focusing on her breath, on the steady rhythm that grounded her. This flight was more than a journey to Chicago. It was another battle in an endless series of small, silent wars. As the plane lifted into the sky, Green emerged from the cockpit again, this time accompanied by another crew member, a younger attendant named Laura. Laura's expression was wary, her gaze flickering between the captain and Ophelia. "Dr. Harris," Green began, the words clipped, as though forced from his mouth. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding earlier. I want to assure you it won't happen again." Ophelia raised an eyebrow, her silence compelling him to continue. "This flight is typically reserved for corporate executives," he added, his tone bordering on condescension despite the apology. "I am a corporate executive," she replied calmly. "Yes, of course," he said quickly, the faintest hint of a flush rising to his cheeks. "But as you can imagine, we have protocols in place to ensure the integrity of our operations." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "And those protocols include questioning the passengers who own the jet?" Laura shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Green, whose jaw tightened. "There's no need to take this personally, Dr. Harris," he said finally, the words clipped and defensive. Ophelia smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. "What you see as protocol, Captain, I see as an assumption. And assumptions are always personal, especially when they seem to follow certain patterns." Green opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. He nodded curtly and stepped back toward the cockpit, his authority diminished but not entirely subdued. Laura lingered for a moment, as though she wanted to say something, but she, too, retreated. Ophelia sat back, her expression serene but her mind sharp. This was the second challenge of the day. And the plane had barely left the ground. The tension was subtle but pervasive. A quiet reminder that the battle for dignity was never truly over. It had only shifted arenas. As the jet leveled out at cruising altitude, Ophelia turned her gaze to the window, watching the clouds roll past. For every moment of defiance, there would be another test. Another subtle maneuver to undermine her presence. She had learned to meet these challenges with grace. But she was tired of the smallness of minds. Tired of carrying the weight of assumptions she had never asked for. And yet, she resolved, she would not be the one to falter. Not today. The quiet hum of the jet engines filled the cabin, a sound meant to soothe and insulate its occupants from the chaos of the outside world. But for Ophelia Harris, the noise only deepened her awareness of the unspoken tensions within these luxurious walls. She was no stranger to the unmarked boundaries people imposed. Boundaries that declared without words who was welcome and who was merely tolerated. Today was proving no different. Not long after the plane leveled out, the younger flight attendant, Laura, reappeared with a meal tray. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down on the table in front of Ophelia. The tray was elegant, with fine china and a meticulously arranged salad. But Ophelia noticed something was missing. "Excuse me," Ophelia said, her tone even but firm. "Could I have the dressing for this?" Laura hesitated, her eyes darting toward the back of the cabin. "I'll check, ma'am," she said softly before scurrying off. Minutes passed, long enough for Ophelia to recognize the familiar rhythm of avoidance. She took a sip of water. Waiting, when Laura returned, she was empty-handed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she stammered. "We seem to have run out." Ophelia raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. She had been on enough flights indeed. Owned enough flights to know that running out of something as basic as salad dressing was highly unlikely. But it wasn't the dressing that mattered. It was the lie. The quiet dismissal disguised as a logistical issue. That echoed louder than any confrontation could. "That's unfortunate," Ophelia said, her voice calm but laced with meaning. "Perhaps next time the flight manifest can ensure that the owner of the jet is adequately accommodated." Laura flushed deeply and mumbled an apology before retreating again. Ophelia let the matter drop. She knew it was pointless to press further. The dressing wasn't the point. It was never the point. Halfway through the flight, Captain Green made another appearance. His tall frame filled the doorway to the cabin, and his forced smile did little to hide the tension etched into his features. "Dr. Harris," he began, his voice a touch too polite. "I wanted to personally apologize for the earlier misunderstanding." Ophelia folded her hands in her lap, watching him with the calm scrutiny of someone who had seen this performance many times before. She nodded slightly, inviting him to continue. "I assure you, we pride ourselves on providing a seamless experience for all of our passengers," he said, his words rehearsed, each one carefully chosen to avoid liability. "If there's anything we can do to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable, please let me know." It was a masterclass in surface-level contrition, the kind designed to soothe without addressing the deeper insult. Ophelia's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. "Thank you, Captain Green," she replied, "but what I require isn't comfort. It's respect, and that, I believe, is beyond your current protocols." His smile faltered for the briefest of moments, the mask slipping just enough for her to see the discomfort behind it. He nodded stiffly and excused himself, retreating to the cockpit. As the flight neared its destination, the jet encountered turbulence, a sudden and sharp reminder of the uncontrollable forces at play. The passengers, few as they were, clutched their armrests as the plane jolted. Ophelia, however, remained calm, her eyes fixed on the view outside the window. She had weathered worse storms than this. When the turbulence subsided, Erin reappeared, her face pale. "Dr. Harris," she said, her voice quieter than before. "The captain wanted me to inform you that we may experience delays upon landing due to unexpected weather." Ophelia nodded but said nothing. She knew there was more behind Erin's nervous demeanor than mere weather delays. These moments of friction, minor, almost invisible to the untrained eye, accumulated like drops of water eroding stone. They were designed to test her resolve, to see if she would bend or break under the weight of 1,000 small slights. But she would not. As the plane began its descent, Ophelia leaned back in her seat, her mind replaying the events of the day. Each moment a missing salad dressing, a half-hearted apology, a strained explanation was part of a larger mosaic, one that painted a picture of a society still struggling to reconcile its ideals with its realities. The lines dividing who was seen and who was invisible, who was respected and who was tolerated, were as clear to her now as they had been all her life. She knew the journey did not end when the wheels touched down. The real turbulence was not in the sky but in the spaces where people refused to confront their own assumptions. And she, Ophelia Harris, would continue to push against those invisible lines, not for the sake of defiance, but for the dignity she knew was her right. The descent into Chicago was smooth, the skyline coming into view as the jet broke through the clouds. The towering buildings reflected the sunlight, a city bustling with life and ambition. But inside the cabin of Ophelia Harris' private jet, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Beneath the surface of polished professionalism and subdued luxury, tension rippled like an undercurrent, quiet but unmistakable. As the wheels touched down, Erin appeared once again, her demeanor more formal than it had been earlier. "Dr. Harris," she began, her voice measured, "we've arrived. We'll be taxiing to the private hangar shortly." Ophelia nodded, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said simply, though the faintest edge in her voice hinted at her exhaustion not from the journey, but from the quiet battles fought along the way. The jet slowed to a stop, and the cabin doors opened to the crisp Chicago air. The ground crew bustled below, their movements efficient, while inside, Captain Green made his final appearance. He lingered at the doorway, his posture tense, as though he were bracing himself for another confrontation. "Dr. Harris," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "I hope your flight was satisfactory." Ophelia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of the silence settle before responding. "It was adequate," she said, her words carrying an unspoken message. That adequate was a standard far below what she deserved. As Ophelia descended the steps of the jet, a black sedan waited for her on the tarmac. The driver, a young man named Marcus, stepped out to greet her, his demeanor warm and respectful. "Welcome to Chicago, Dr. Harris," he said, opening the door for her. "Thank you, Marcus," she replied, her voice softening for the first time that day. She settled into the back seat, the familiar comfort of the car a brief respite from the subtle hostilities she had endured. But the day's challenges were far from over. The drive to the Harper Holdings office was uneventful, the city's rhythm unfolding outside the car window. When they arrived, the building, a sleek, modern structure that reflected her company's forward-thinking ethos, stood tall against the backdrop of the bustling streets. Ophelia stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she entered the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman named Claire, greeted her with the same practiced politeness Ophelia had encountered countless times before. But there was a flicker of hesitation as Claire's eyes darted between Ophelia and the screen in front of her. "Good morning, Dr. Harris," she said, her tone slightly uncertain. "I didn't realize you'd be visiting today. I prefer not to announce my arrivals," Ophelia replied, her smile faint but pointed. "It keeps everyone on their toes." Claire nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Of course, I'll notify Mr. Thompson that you're here." Ophelia made her way to the top floor, where the executive offices were housed. As she entered the boardroom, the low hum of conversation ceased abruptly. The room was filled with Harper Holdings executives, most of them older, most of them white. Their surprise at seeing her was palpable, though no one dared to voice it. She took her seat at the head of the table, her presence a stark contrast to the tension in the room. The meeting began, and as the agenda unfolded, Ophelia noticed the subtle ways her authority was questioned. A pointed remark about legacy leadership, a dismissive tone when discussing her strategic initiatives, a sideways glance that lingered just a beat too long. But it was when Robert, one of the senior executives, directly challenged her decision on an upcoming project that the undercurrent of doubt surfaced fully. "With all due respect, Dr. Harris," he said, his tone measured but condescending, "this initiative feels ambitious. Perhaps we should reconsider the timing." Ophelia tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp. "Ambitious? Or necessary?" she replied. "Perhaps you'd like to clarify." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence faltering under her scrutiny. I simply mean that we should proceed cautiously. Caution is important, she said, her voice calm but firm. But stagnation is not an option. This initiative is not just ambitious, it's critical. And it will proceed as planned. Her words settled over the room like a stone dropped into still water. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken tensions. Ophelia knew what they were thinking, knew how her presence disrupted their expectations. But she also knew that disruption was necessary. Change was never comfortable. As the meeting concluded, Ophelia lingered in the boardroom, letting the others leave before her. She stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The day had been filled with challenges, each one a reminder of the barriers that still existed, even at the highest levels of power. But Ophelia Harris had not built her empire by yielding to those barriers. She had built it by breaking them, one by one, with grace and determination, and she would continue to do so, not just for herself, but for the countless others who faced the same quiet, insidious challenges every day. She straightened her blazer and turned to leave the room, her steps purposeful. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The corridors of Harper Holdings were lined with polished steel and glass, reflecting the sleek, modern ethos of the company Ophelia Harris had built. Yet, even within these walls she had designed and funded, there lingered the faint but undeniable echoes of resistance. These echoes were not loud, they rarely were. Instead, they whispered in the form of polite dismissals, patronizing tones, and questions framed as concerns. After the board meeting, Ophelia returned to her office. It was a corner suite, flooded with natural light, its walls adorned with framed awards, photographs of her family, and a few choice pieces of art that reflected her taste and heritage. She sat at her desk, her fingers poised over her laptop's keyboard. But her thoughts were elsewhere. Her assistant, Marla, knocked gently before entering. "Dr. Harris," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "Robert asked if you'd be available to discuss the new initiative further. He seems concerned about some of the numbers." Ophelia's lips tightened, but she forced a smile. "Concerned," she repeated softly, as though tasting the word. "Tell him I'm available at 4. But also remind him that the numbers have already been approved by the finance team." Marla nodded, but her hesitation didn't go unnoticed. Ophelia tilted her head slightly. "Something on your mind, Marla?" Marla's cheeks flushed. "It's just, I think Robert's trying to rally support to delay the project. I overheard him talking to some of the other executives earlier." Ophelia leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but her mind racing. This wasn't the first time she had faced internal opposition. She had fought for her position every step of the way. But the resistance always found new forms. Now, it seemed, it was clothed in the guise of fiscal caution and strategic prudence. "Thank you for letting me know," Ophelia said. "That will be all for now." At 4 o'clock sharp, Robert arrived at her office. He was dressed impeccably, his demeanor polished, but Ophelia could see the calculation in his eyes. He began with pleasantries, commenting on the view from her window. But she cut him off gently. "You wanted to discuss the initiative?" she prompted. "Yes," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I've been reviewing the projections again. And while the potential for growth is clear, I'm concerned about the timing. Launching this now could expose us to unnecessary risk." Ophelia nodded slowly, letting him speak, though her expression gave away nothing. "I think it would be prudent to postpone the launch by 6 months." He continued, "just to ensure the market conditions are more favorable." She folded her hands on the desk, her gaze steady. "And what do you believe will change in 6 months, Robert?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her question. "Well, the economic landscape is unpredictable." "It always is," she interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "But this initiative isn't about waiting for the perfect conditions. It's about creating them. You're worried about risk, but I see opportunity." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand. "Let me be clear," she continued. "This initiative has been thoroughly vetted. The data supports it, the market demands it, and our stakeholders expect it. Delaying it now would send the wrong message internally and externally. We're not here to hesitate, Robert, we're here to lead." Her words hung in the air, heavy with authority. Robert sat back, clearly realizing that his objections would gain no traction here. "Of course, Dr. Harris," he said finally, his tone deferential. "I trust your judgment." She nodded. A small victory won, but she knew the battle was far from over. Later that evening, as the office emptied and the city lights began to glow, Ophelia stayed behind, reviewing documents in the quiet of her office. The day's events played in her mind, each interaction a reminder of how the obstacles she faced were not overt but insidious, embedded in the very fabric of the spaces she occupied. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Marcus, her driver. "Dr. Harris, I noticed some protesters gathering outside the building as I was parking. They don't seem violent, but I thought you should know." Ophelia frowned. She stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. A small crowd had gathered, their signs indistinct from this distance. But the energy was clear. This, too, was familiar. Public scrutiny often followed her decisions, especially when they challenged the status quo. She had faced protests before, some fueled by genuine concerns, others by prejudice thinly veiled as opposition to corporate overreach. She sighed, the weight of leadership pressing heavily on her shoulders. There was no escaping the scrutiny, no respite from the constant need to prove herself. But she would not retreat. The chapter closes with Ophelia standing at the window, her reflection blending with the lights of the city below. Each challenge, whether in the boardroom or on the streets, was a reminder of the walls she had yet to tear down. And though those walls were built on assumptions and fears older than the city itself, she resolved to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told, in words or in silence, that they did not belong. Night had settled over the city, but the lights of Harper Holdings offices burned brightly, a beacon of unyielding ambition. Ophelia Harris remained in her corner office, the hum of her computer the only sound breaking the stillness. The day's challenges lingered in her mind like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Outside, the protesters had grown in number. Their chants rose faintly through the glass, a chorus of discontent, though their words were still indistinct. Ophelia leaned back in her chair, her eyes heavy with fatigue but her spirit sharp. This wasn't the first time she had been the focus of public ire, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet, what unsettled her was not the protests themselves but the realization of how deeply the threads of opposition wove into every corner of her life, subtle, persistent, and all too familiar. The phone on her desk buzzed. It was Marla. "Dr. Harris, the security team would like to brief you on the situation outside. They're concerned it could escalate." Ophelia paused for a moment before replying, "Send them in." Moments later, 2 security officers entered, their expressions taut. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Davis, spoke first. "Dr. Harris, we've been monitoring the crowd. So far, it's peaceful, but we've noticed some individuals who seem agitated. It might be wise to leave through the back entrance tonight." Ophelia regarded him calmly. "And what message does that send?" she asked, her voice measured. "That I'm afraid? That I can be intimidated?" Davis hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond. "It's about safety, ma'am," he said finally. "We don't want to take any chances." "I appreciate your concern," she replied, "but I won't be sneaking out of my own building like a thief in the night. I'll leave as I always do, through the front." The officers exchanged glances but nodded, their reluctance evident. As they left, Ophelia turned back to the window, her reflection staring back at her. It was a small act of defiance, perhaps, but in a world that constantly sought to undermine her, even small acts mattered. The next morning brought a new challenge, one that was as insidious as it was predictable. An email arrived from Robert, marked urgent, requesting an unscheduled meeting with the board. The subject line read, "Revisiting the initiative." Ophelia read the email carefully, her lips pressing into a thin line. The tone was veiled, but the intent was clear: another attempt to stall, to question her authority under the guise of prudence. She forwarded the email to Marla with a simple instruction: schedule it for noon. No delays. By noon, the boardroom was filled again. Robert sat at the far end of the table, flanked by a few allies whose expressions betrayed their alignment before they even spoke. Ophelia took her seat at the head, her posture unyielding. Robert began with a preamble, couching his objections in the language of fiscal responsibility and shareholder trust. He gestured to a series of charts projected on the screen, pointing out risks that had already been addressed in prior meetings. "This isn't about questioning your leadership, Dr. Harris," he said, his tone patronizing. It's about ensuring that we move forward in a way that protects the company's legacy." Ophelia let him speak, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. When he finished, she leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Legacy," she repeated, her tone deliberate. "That's an interesting choice of words, Robert, because if this company's legacy is one of fear and hesitation, then I suppose you're right, we should reconsider. But that's not the legacy I've built. Harper Holdings didn't rise to where it is by waiting for the world to make us comfortable. We got here by seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles." Her words hung in the air, challenging not just Robert but everyone in the room. "Now," she continued, her voice firm, "if there are valid concerns about this initiative, new concerns, ones that haven't already been addressed, I'm willing to hear them. But if this is just another attempt to stall progress, let me assure you, it will not succeed." Robert shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. The others exchanged uneasy glances, their hesitation speaking louder than words. "Very well," he said finally, his tone subdued. "Let's proceed as planned." Ophelia nodded, satisfied but not complacent. She knew this was just another battle in an ongoing war. That evening, as Ophelia prepared to leave the office, the protesters were still there, their signs now visible. Some bore messages of genuine concern about corporate accountability, about equity, but others were more pointed, their words dripping with bias thinly veiled as critique. "Who's really in charge here?" one sign read, its implication unmistakable. Ophelia paused at the building's entrance, her driver waiting nearby. She looked out at the crowd, her presence momentarily silencing their chants. For a brief moment, she considered speaking to them, addressing their concerns directly, but she knew this wasn't the time. She stepped into the car, her resolve as firm as ever. The chapter ends with Ophelia staring out of the car window as the city blurs past. The day had been long, the challenges relentless, but she felt no despair. If anything, the resistance only strengthened her resolve. For every barrier she faced, she knew there were others watching, others who drew strength from her defiance, others who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles. Her journey was far from over, but she would continue to walk it, knowing that every step forward was a victory not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in a world where dignity and justice were not privileges but rights. The next morning, Ophelia Harris arrived at Harper Holdings earlier than usual. The city was still waking up, its streets bathed in the pale blue light of dawn. But even in the quiet hours, the weight of the day ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders. The tension from the protests lingered in her mind, and the internal resistance within her company was as present as ever. As she stepped into the lobby, she noticed Claire, the receptionist, shifting uncomfortably behind the desk. When Claire glanced up and saw Ophelia, she hesitated before offering a tight smile. "Good morning, Dr. Harris," Claire said. "Good morning, Claire," Ophelia replied. "Everything all right?" Claire hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a clipboard. There's something you should see. It's been circulating online." Ophelia frowned as Claire turned her screen around. On it was a video, shaky but clear enough to recognize the Harper Holdings building in the background. A man stood before a small crowd of protesters, speaking into a microphone. His words were measured but pointed. "We're here because corporations like Harper Holdings claim to be progressive, claim to champion diversity. But look closely," he said, his voice amplified by a portable speaker. "Look at who's making the decisions. Who's really benefiting? We're here to ask, who does Ophelia Harris really represent?" The crowd murmured in agreement as the man continued, his accusations growing sharper, though he didn't say it outright. The insinuation was clear: Ophelia's leadership, her very presence, was being framed as a symbol of exclusion rather than progress. Ophelia's jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the screen. This wasn't the first time her integrity had been questioned, but the familiarity of the attack didn't make it sting any less. "Thank you, Claire," she said, her tone calm. "I'll handle it." Ophelia spent the morning addressing the ripple effects of the video. Her public relations team was already drafting statements, their language carefully crafted to deflect criticism without fanning the flames. But as she reviewed their work, she felt a growing frustration. The words felt hollow, disconnected from the truth of what she faced every day. By midday, the tension boiled over during a meeting with the executive team. Robert, emboldened by the external criticism, seized the opportunity to voice his concerns once again. "With all due respect, Dr. Harris," he began, his tone overly formal, "perhaps we need to consider the optics here. The protests aren't just about the initiative, they're about perception. Maybe we need to pause and reassess." Ophelia's gaze bore into him, her patience wearing thin. "Pause and reassess?" she repeated. "And what exactly do you think that will accomplish, Robert? Appeasing people who've already decided to misrepresent what we stand for?" Robert shifted uncomfortably, but he pressed on. "It's not just about them, Dr. Harris. It's about stakeholders, about public trust. If we're seen as out of touch." "Out of touch?" Ophelia interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Do you think I don't understand what's at stake? Do you think I haven't spent my entire career navigating these waters? Balancing perception and reality?" The room fell silent. Ophelia's words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. She leaned forward, her hands resting on the table. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about perception. This is about who we are and what we stand for. I will not allow fear, whether it comes from outside this building or within it, to dictate our decisions. We move forward, period." As the day wore on, Ophelia found herself reflecting on the deeper roots of the resistance she faced. It wasn't just about the initiative or the protests. It was about the quiet storm of prejudice that had shadowed her every step. People who questioned her authority didn't do so openly, they cloaked their doubts in polite suggestions and subtle critiques. It was the same storm she had weathered as a young woman, navigating boardrooms where she was the only one who looked like her. It was the storm that whispered, "You don't belong here," even as she built an empire. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Ophelia stopped by the window of her office. The protesters were still there, their numbers smaller now but no less vocal. She watched them for a moment, her reflection merging with the city lights beyond. She thought about what her mother used to say when the world seemed particularly cruel: "You can't control the storm, but you can decide how you walk through it." Ophelia straightened her shoulders and turned away from the window. She wasn't just walking through the storm, she was reshaping it, one step at a time. The boardroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm but doesn't promise calm. Ophelia Harris sat at the head of the long table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Around her, the executives shuffled papers, their movements betraying unease. It was an unscheduled meeting, called by Ophelia herself, and its urgency was palpable. For weeks, the protests outside Harper Holdings had grown louder, their message muddled by misinformation but undeniably potent. Inside the company, dissent simmered beneath the surface. The intersection of public outcry and internal resistance had created a perfect storm, one that Ophelia could no longer ignore. She took a deep breath and began. "Let's talk about the truth," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "Not the sanitized truth that fits neatly into a press release, but the real truth about what's happening here." The room stiffened. Ophelia let her words settle before continuing. "The protests outside our building aren't just about a single initiative. They're about something much deeper, something this company, and every person in this room, needs to confront. They're about who we are and who we claim to be." Robert, predictably, was the first to speak. "With all due respect, Dr. Harris," he said, his tone tinged with condescension, "we've already addressed these issues. The public doesn't understand the nuances of corporate decision-making. This is a PR problem, not a leadership one." Ophelia turned to him, her gaze sharp. "No, Robert," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's a leadership problem because we've allowed it to become one. And let me be clear, the public understands far more than you give them credit for. What they see are the cracks we've ignored for too long." She stood, her presence commanding the room. "We talk about diversity, we talk about inclusion, but too often, those words are just decorations on a mission statement. The reality is that people like me, people who don't fit the mold of what leadership is supposed to look like, are still fighting to prove we belong. Even when we've earned our place 100 times over." Her words cut through the tension like a blade, exposing the unspoken truths that had lingered in the room for years. As the meeting continued, Ophelia outlined a plan not just to move the initiative forward, but to confront the deeper issues at the heart of the resistance. She proposed new systems of accountability, mandatory bias training, and greater transparency in decision-making processes. It was ambitious, even radical, but it was also necessary. "This isn't just about protecting our brand," she said. "It's about living up to the principles we claim to stand for. If we're not willing to do that, then what's the point?" By the time the meeting adjourned, the room was buzzing with a mix of resistance and reluctant agreement. Ophelia knew the path forward wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was the only way. As the executives filed out, she stayed behind, watching the city below through the large windows. The protesters were still there, their signs illuminated by the streetlights. But tonight, something felt different. The noise wasn't just a reminder of the challenges she faced, it was a testament to the power of voices refusing to be silenced. Later that evening, Ophelia joined Marcus in the waiting car. The ride home was quiet, the hum of the city fading into the background as she reflected on the day. When they stopped at a red light, she glanced out the window and saw a young woman holding a sign that read, "We deserve better." The words struck a chord. They weren't just about the company or the protests, they were about everything she had fought for. Everything she continued to fight for. The right to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. When she arrived home, the night was still. Ophelia stepped into her living room, where a photograph of her parents sat on the mantel. They had taught her resilience, taught her that the fight for justice was never over, but always worth it. She stood there for a moment, the weight of the day pressing on her. But she felt no despair. Instead, she felt a quiet determination. The challenges she faced were daunting, but they were not insurmountable. And as long as she had the strength to stand, she would continue to push forward, not just for herself, but for everyone who came after her.